Critical success and cult classic are phrases in the video game industry that get bandied about probably more than they should. But what about the games that, despite the fanfare and decent scores, get sidelined? There are too many games that get pushed aside because you've heard from a friend of a friend that it wasn't good, or have been put off by a third outing because the second sequel wasn't as good. Fans are fickle, we know, but whatever the reasoning, there's a slew of games that don't get the love they deserve. Fittingly, a bunch of these entries involve time travel, so with that in mind, why not take a trip back in time and maybe consider rewriting your opinion on a couple of these entries. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games that don't get the love they deserve. Number 10. Resident Evil Code Veronica. Given the discourse around console-timed exclusivity, let's take a look at an early entry that really upset fans back at the turn of the century. Resident Evil, despite a launch on the Sega Saturn II, became synonymous with the PlayStation. So when it came to the next generation of Resident Evil, the logical expectation was that it'd be on the PS2. Instead, it was announced for the Sega Dreamcast, an already failing console, and that certainly didn't help out the initial reception for Code Veronica. But looking back on it, Code Veronica still holds up as one of the more credible canonical entries in the convoluted timeline of Resident Evil's history. It has all the hallmarks of a traditional game, the tank controls, nonsensical puzzles that make no practical sense, as well as tough boss fights. Yet today, it still gets regarded as the black sheep, even though it does make more sense and it's arguably more faithful than the likes of, say, Resident Evil 6. Perhaps now it's harder to get into, as any old Resident Evil is, given that we've had remakes and reboots, but that doesn't make it any less an important entry in what we can call classic Resident Evil. However, we can't apologize for Steve Burnside though. That kid's annoying. Number 9. Enslaved Odyssey to the West. Sometimes a game can get rave critical reviews, but a fan base just isn't into it, or a fan base absolutely loves it even though the critics saw absolutely nothing to rave about. Yet there are other times when games just come and go, to little fanfare and smaller sales. Enslaved Odyssey to the West is one such example. Developed by the now renowned Ninja Theory of Hellblade fame, their loose adaptation of the Chinese fable came out to okay reviews and a few performance criticisms in 2010. Yet look past that, and Enslaved features traversal and exploration that would put Uncharted to the test, and has combat on par with the best Prince of Persia games. Not only that, it features some strong characterization, largely helped by industry mocap favorite Andy Serkis, leading the cast as Monkey, a rogue with a heart of gold trope protagonist. Whilst it is a reimagining, the story may be a little formulaic and the end a tad disappointing, granted. As a sum of its part kind of adventure, the varying views and locales make up for it, as do the boss fights, as Monkey and Tripitaka take a bevy of mechanical beasts of differing size and tactic. It's a shame it came and went, but if you like an action platformer, this journey is well worth it. Number 8. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. Another game that moved from its established console base, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker already upset fans by the announcement, bearing in mind that it wasn't the first, as the MGS Acid games were on the PSP prior. Another point of ire was the switch from the linear level-based progression to a sort of hub style akin to the likes of Monster Hunter. But look at it this way, this hub pick missions from a list gameplay became the precursor to the Phantom Pain, and look how well the mechanic was received there. Admittedly, Peace Walker is a vastly different MGS than its predecessors. At the time, despite strong critical reviews, Peace Walker was seen as a deviation from what the franchise established. It's interesting though, looking back, especially now knowing what we know from the critical and fan success for Metal Gear Solid 5, a lot of that was established by Peace Walker. Players shouldn't be afraid of change, as it often leads to positive results down the line. Besides, if you're worried about the integrity of it being a Metal Gear Solid game, there is a character called Hot Cold Man in it, so Kojima's right there. Number 7. Terminator Resistance. Movie tie-in games are always a bit of a dice roll, and a nasty dice roll at that. For every Spider-Man 2 2004 tie-in, we get an ET, which is not so great. Yet whilst Terminator Resistance isn't a direct movie tie-in, it does bridge some narrative gaps in the franchise. Without trying to get too convoluted, it tells the other side of the story, about the Resistance trying to stop Skynet from sending Terminators back in time. We know it doesn't work, or we'd have no franchise. If players going back into Terminator Resistance expected a well-refined, realistic first-person shooter experience, oh, they're gonna have a bad time. This is the team that made the awful Rambo game some years back, mind, though they got better. However, temper those expectations generations back, and Resistance is actually a pretty fun arcade-style shooter. It has a few moments of jank to it, granted, but treat it like a love letter to the franchise, and it's actually a pretty decent romp. Number 6. Bulletstorm. Bulletstorm arguably gets kind of an unfair rap, and that's probably because it's compared to Cliff Bleszinski's other macho shooter, Gears of War. Whilst it does involve big burly men in power armor, Bulletstorm is definitely more a comedic affair. Also, lots of groin shooting threats. Back in 2011, gamers were already inundated with too many serious shooters, depicting the grim realities of war and all that jazz. Even now in 2022, we're still constantly reminded that, as it turns out, war is bad. And that's why we need some levity. Bulletstorm did exactly that. It brought crass humor, it brought silly violence and weaponry, yet it also brought that air of self-awkwardness that dinosaurs like Duke Nukem lacked. The irony being that Duke's inclusion in the remaster makes him aware of what a relic he is. Bulletstorm never let up. When you've got shotguns that can tear a man in half, or a sniper rifle with user-guided bullets, sometimes it's just nice to go daft and cause point-based carnage. Number 5. Chrono Cross. There's an argument to be made whether Chrono Cross is a sequel or a spin-off. The writer of this particular article believes it is, but the Wikipedia entry tends to flip-flop. Regardless, Chrono Cross often gets shunned for one simple, easily quantifiable, and equally childish reason. It's not Chrono Trigger. Well, it's not Chrono Trigger 2. Yet look at it realistically. How could you make a sequel? Building on an established mechanic from Trigger, Cross incorporated elements into its own time and mind-bending story. Still following the same narrative angles involving casualty, consequence, and otherworldly entities, it took that formula and thrust it into turn-of-the-century JRPG annals. Despite receiving critical acclaim, many purists still argue about it on forums today. Don't get drawn in, honestly. Whilst it's all too easy to let someone's bias put you off, sometimes it's easier to just seek out something on an impartial basis. Sequel or spin-off, consider Cross a companion piece to Trigger instead, and prepare to get lost in another epic time-space adventure. Number 4. Splinter Cell Blacklist. In terms of the Splinter Cell series, it has an absolute high in chaos theory and a lowish point in conviction, more so because it deviated from the formula too drastically. Yet when it comes to Blacklist, a lot of players felt the damage was done and it wasn't basically more chaos theory. It also didn't help that Sam Fisher's voice actor was changed, and a lot of people were not a fan of that. But when it boils down to it, Blacklist is actually a solid game that at least tried to modernize the stealth action series. Many saw it as too bombastic, but if played properly, stealth was still a viable option. It just wasn't as slow and methodical as the older ones. But has anyone played them recently? Take off the rose-tinted night goggles and you might find something really good here. It also added a multi-directional approach to its side missions, changing up the linear gameplay somewhat. It also had a slew of exciting co-op missions, which are still available on local split-screen multiplayer now. It's a shame then that gamers did vote with their wallets here and effectively ended up killing off the franchise. Although, hopefully the Splinter Cell remake that has been confirmed will change that. Number 3. Disco Elysium. Now, before you start crying out, what do you mean? This is a beloved and subversive RPG. Hear us out. This isn't aimed at the ones who've played it. It's more an entry that's pointing the finger at those who say this game is simply too pretentious for its own good. Now, will I ever stop getting out my poster every single time I get an opportunity to talk about Disco Elysium on WhatCulture? I didn't even write this one. Probably not. I don't know. Stick with me, you'll find out. On the surface, yes, Disco Elysium is a very wordsy and almost aloof game in terms of the narrative RPG genre, which admittedly does look a hard title to get into. But it's when players give it more than the opening few hours that it opens up into something much more. To spoil would be too easy, as well as depriving those that go in blind to the madness. Even saying the madness is too much of a giveaway when it comes down to it. Look, we'll put it this way, you're a hungover cop who can die trying to recover his tie from a ceiling fan. Come on. Sometimes a game's own hype and pretension can put people off, but perseverance is key, as it is with any RPG. Once the rhythm gets going, and some of it makes sense, there's one hell of a game to get stuck into here. Number 2. Deathloop. As the most recent game on this list, Deathloop had all the makings to be a smash hit for Arcane and Bethesda. Deathloop, even without studio comparisons, looked set to reinvent the rogue and time loop style of game so prevalent in recent years. Death wasn't definitive, just an inconvenience in Cult's mission. Except it came out to very mixed reviews. Obvious comparisons to Dishonored's stealth or Prey's exploration mechanics were made, with it being regarded as too too actiony and linear respectively. Yet, and this may shock you, it's neither of those things. Yes, there is a linear day-night structure and you can go in guns blazing, but that's really not the sum of this game. Half the fun is working out the plan to end the loop, and the other is in trying to execute it without causing too much reaction that disrupts everything like a sci-fi domino effect. Paired with an invasion mechanic that can be set to AI if you like, Deathloop is a surprisingly witty and deeply explorative game, just like any of Arcane's offerings. Go off the beaten track, find new and inventive ways to kill visionaries, and there's an extremely deep and well-written game in here. Number 1. Onimusha 3 Demon Siege. When it comes to the rule of diminishing returns, it's usually the third entry that suffers the most. Yet in Onimusha's case, the third one is an underrated gem. Continuing that Resident Evil but Japan thing that Capcom started, Onimusha 3 raised the bar for what the series could do. Again, another game on this list with time travel elements, this game utilized them so well it has to be mentioned. Seeing your series hero launched into the future while Jacques takes a trip to the past offered up some interesting dual timeline gameplay. The usual puzzles were there, this time with a past-present mechanic in place. Pair that with the refined combat that the series is known for, and the third outing was an absolutely pleasant surprise that fans weren't necessarily expecting. It'd be fair to say that this was the peak of the series, with the spin-offs not quite hitting the same stride. If anything, it still has the best introduction FMV to any video game ever. That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment box if you can think of any other video games that do not get the love they deserve, and we'll make sure it gets that down in that comment section. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm at Jess McDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more gaming goodness.